Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I said I would respond personally to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee report on extending British military operations to Syria. I've done so today, and copies of my response have been made available to every member of the House. The committee produced a comprehensive report which asked a series of important questions. I've also tried to listen very carefully to the questions and views expressed by members on all sides of the House. And I want to try and answer all of the relevant questions today. There are different ways of putting them, but they boil down to this. Why? Why us? Why now? Is what we're contemplating legal? Where are the ground troops to help us meet our objectives? What is the strategy that brings together everything that we're doing, particularly in Syria? Is there an end to this conflict? And is there a plan for what follows? So let me deal with each of these questions as directly as I can. First, why? Mr. Speaker, the reason for acting is the very direct threat that ISIL poses to our country and to our way of life. ISIL have attacked Ankara, Beirut, and of course Paris, as well as the likely blowing up of a Russian plane with 224 people on board. They've already taken the lives of British hostages and inspired the worst terrorist attack against British people since 7/7 on the beaches of Tunisia. And crucially, they have repeatedly tried to attack us right here in Britain. In the last 12 months, our police and security services have disrupted no fewer than 7 terrorist plots to attack the UK, every one of which was either linked to ISIL or inspired by their propaganda. So I'm in no doubt that it is in our national interest for action to be taken to stop them. And stopping them means taking action in Syria because it is Raqqa that is their headquarters. But why us? Mr. Speaker, my first responsibility as Prime Minister and our first job in this House is to keep the British people safe. We have the assets to do that, and we can significantly extend the capabilities of the international coalition forces. That is one reason why members of the international coalition, including President Obama and President Hollande, have made it clear to me that they want Britain to stand with them in joining airstrikes in Syria as well as Iraq. These are our closest allies, and they want our help. Partly this is about our capabilities. As we're showing in Iraq, the RAF can carry out what is called dynamic targeting, where our pilots can strike the most difficult targets at rapid pace and with extraordinary precision, and provide vital battle-winning close air support to local forces on the ground. We have the Brimstone precision missile system, which enables us to strike accurately with minimum collateral damage, something that even the Americans do not have. The Raptor pod on our Tornado aircraft has no rival, currently gathering 60% of the coalition's entire tactical reconnaissance in Iraq, while also being equipped for strikes. In addition, our Reaper drones are providing up to 30% of the intelligence in Syria, but are not currently able to use their low collateral, high precision missile systems. And we also have the proven ability to sustain our operations, not just for weeks, but if necessary, for months into the future. So, Mr. Speaker, of course we have these capabilities, but the most important answer to the question, why us, is, I believe, even more fundamental. And it's this: we shouldn't be content with outsourcing our security to our allies. If we believe that action can help protect us, then with our allies, we should be part of that action, not standing aside from it. And from this moral point comes a fundamental question. If we won't act now, when our friend and ally France has been struck in this way, then our allies in the world can be forgiven for asking, if not now, when? And that leads to the next question: why now? The first answer to that, of course, is because of the grave danger that ISIL poses to our security, a danger that has clearly intensified in recent weeks. But there are additional reasons why action now is so important. Just look at what has changed. Not just the attack in Paris, but the world has come together and agreed a UN Security Council resolution. And there is a real political process underway. This could lead to a new government in Syria with whom we can work to defeat ISIL for good. But as I explained to the House yesterday, we can't wait for that to be complete before we begin acting to degrade ISIL and reducing their capability to attack us. So let's be clear about the military objectives that we are pursuing. Yes, we want to defeat the terrorists by dismantling their networks, stopping their funding, targeting their training camps, and taking out those plotting terrorist attacks against the UK. But there is a broader objective. For as long as ISIL can peddle the myth of a so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria, it will be a rallying call for Islamist extremists all around the world. And that makes us less safe. Just as we've reduced the scale and size of the so-called caliphate in Iraq, increasingly pushing it out of Iraq, so we need to do the same thing in Syria. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, another reason for action now is that the success in Iraq in squeezing the so-called caliphate is put at risk by our failure to act in Syria. This border is not recognized by ISIL, and we seriously hamper our efforts if we stop acting when we reach the Syrian border. So when we come to the question, why now, we have to ask ourselves whether the risks of inaction are greater than the risks of taking action. Every day we fail to act is a day when ISIL can grow stronger and more plots can be undertaken. Mr. Speaker, that is why all the advice I've received, the military advice, the diplomatic advice, and the security advice, all says yes, that the risks of inaction are greater. Some have asked specifically whether taking action could make the UK more of a target for ISIL attacks. So let me tell the House that the judgment of the Director General of the Security Service and the Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee is that the UK is already in the top tier of countries that ISIL is targeting. So I'm clear that the only way to deal with that reality is to address the threat we face and to do so now. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the question of legality. It's a long-standing constitutional convention that we don't publish our formal legal advice. But the document I've published today shows in some detail the clear legal basis for military action against ISIL in Syria. It's founded on the right of self-defense as recognized in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. The right of self-defense may be exercised individually, where it is necessary to the UK's own defence, and of course collectively in the defence of our friends and allies. Mr. Speaker, the main basis of the global coalition's actions against ISIL in Syria is the collective self-defence of Iraq. Iraq has a legitimate government, one that we support and help. There's a solid basis of evidence on which to conclude, firstly, that there's a direct link between the presence and activities of ISIL in Syria and their ongoing attack in Iraq. And secondly, that the Assad regime is unwilling and or unable to take action necessary to prevent ISIL's continuing attack on Iraq, or indeed attacks on us. It's also clear that ISIL's campaign against the UK and our allies has reached the level of an armed attack, such that force may lawfully be used in self-defense to prevent further atrocities being committed by ISIL. And this is further underscored by the unanimous adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2249. We should be clear about what this resolution means and what it says. The whole world came together, including all 5 members of the Security Council, to agree this resolution unanimously. The resolution states that ISIL, and I quote, constitutes a global and unprecedented threat to international peace and security. It calls for member states to take, and again I quote, all necessary measures to prevent and suppress terrorist acts committed specifically by ISIL. And crucially, it says that we should, and again I quote, eradicate the safe haven they've established over significant parts of Iraq and Syria. Now, turning to the question of which ground forces will assist us. In Iraq, the answer is clear. We have the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga. In Syria, the situation is more complex. But as the report I'm publishing today shows, we believe there are around 70,000 Syrian opposition fighters, principally the Free Syrian Army, who do not belong to extremist groups and with whom we can coordinate attacks on ISIL. In addition, there are the Kurdish armed groups who have also shown themselves capable of taking territory, holding territory, and administering it, and crucially relieving the suffering that the civilian population had endured under ISIL control. The Syrian Kurds have successfully defended Kurdish areas in northern Syria and retaken territory around the city of Kobane. Moderate armed Sunni Arabs have proved capable of defending territory north of Aleppo, and they stopped ISIL's attempts to capture the main humanitarian border crossing with Turkey and sweeping into Idlib province. In the south of Syria, the southern front of the Free Syrian Army has consolidated its control over significant areas and has worked to prevent terrorists from operating. These people I've talked about, they are ground troops. They need our help. When they get it, they succeed. So in my view, we should do more to help them from the air. But those who ask questions about ground troops are absolutely right to do so. The full answer can't be achieved until there is a new Syrian government that represents all of the Syrian people, not just Sunni, Shia and Alawite, but Christian, Druze and others. And it is this new government who will be the natural partners for our forces in defeating ISIL for good. Mr. Speaker, we can't defeat ISIL simply from the air or purely with military action alone. It requires a full political settlement. But the question is, can we wait for that settlement before we take action? And again, my answer is no, we can't. On the question about whether this is part of an overall strategy, the answer is yes. Our approach has 4 pillars. First, our counter-extremism strategy means we have a comprehensive plan to prevent and foil plots at home and also to address the poisonous extremist ideology that is the root cause of the threat that we face. Second, our support for the diplomatic and political process. And we should be clear about this process. Many across this House rightly said how vital it is to have all the key regional players around the table, including Iran and Russia. And we're now seeing Iran and Saudi Arabia sitting down around the same table with America and Russia, as well as, of course, France, Turkey and Britain. And all of us working towards the transition to a new government in Syria. Now, the third pillar is the military action I'm describing to degrade ISIL and reduce the threat they pose. It is working in Iraq, and I believe it can work in Syria. Now, the fourth pillar is immediate humanitarian support, but even more crucially, longer-term stabilisation. Of course, this House has heard many times that Britain has so far given over £1.1 billion, by far the largest commitment of any European country, second only to the United States of America. And this is helping to reduce the need for Syrians to attempt the perilous journey to Europe. And the donor conference I'm hosting in February, together with Germany, Kuwait, Norway and the UN, I believe that will help further. But the House is rightly also asking more questions about whether there will be a proper post-conflict reconstruction effort to support a new Syrian government when it emerges. And Britain's answer to that question is absolutely yes. I can tell the House that Britain would be prepared to contribute at least another £1 billion for this task. So all these elements, counter-terrorism, political and diplomatic, military and humanitarian, they need to happen together to achieve a long-term solution in Syria. We know that peace is a process, not an event, and I'm clear that it can't be achieved through a military assault on ISIL alone. It also requires the removal of Assad through a political transition. But I'm also clear about the sequencing that needs to take place. Mr. Speaker, this is an ISIL-first strategy. What of the end goal? So, Mr. Speaker, the initial objective is to damage ISIL and reduce its capacity to do us harm. And I believe that this can, in time, lead to its eradication. No one predicted ISIL's rise, and we should not accept that it's somehow impossible to bring them to an end. They are not what the people of Iraq and Syria want. They don't represent the true religion of Islam, and they're losing ground in Iraq following losses in Sinjar and Baji. Now, we are not naive to the complexity of the task. It will require patience and persistence. And our work won't be complete until we've reached our true end goal, which is having governments in both Iraq and Syria which can command the confidence of all their peoples. And in Syria, ultimately, that means a government without Assad. As Ban Ki-moon has said, a missile can kill a terrorist, but only good governance can kill terrorism. This applies so clearly to both Iraq and Syria. Now, Mr. Speaker, as we discuss all these things, people also want to know that we've learnt the lessons of previous conflicts. Whatever anyone thought of the Iraq War, terrible mistakes were made in the aftermath in dismantling the state and the institutions of that country. And we must never make those mistakes again. The political process in Syria will in time deliver new leadership, and that is the transition we must support. We are not in the business of dismantling the Syrian state or its institutions. In Libya, the state and its institutions have been hollowed out after 40 years of dictatorship. When the dictatorship went, the institutions rapidly collapsed. But the big difference between Libya and Syria is that in Syria this time we have firm international commitment from all the backers of a future Syrian government around the table at the Vienna talks. The commitment is clear: to preserve and develop the state in Syria and allow a new representative government to govern for all its people. So, Mr. Speaker, I have attempted to answer the main questions. Why? Why now? Why us? Is it legal? What are the ground forces? Is there a strategy? What is the end point? And what is the plan for reconstruction? But I know this is a highly complex situation, and I know members on all sides will have other questions which I look forward to trying to answer this morning. One will be about the confused and confusing situation in Syria with regard to Russia's intervention. Mr. Speaker, let me reassure the House that the American-led Combined Air Operations Center has a memorandum of understanding with the Russians. This enables daily contact and pragmatic military planning to ensure the safety of all coalition forces, and this would include our brave RAF pilots. Another question will be about whether we are taking sides in a Sunni versus Shia conflict. This simply is not the case. Yes, ISIL is a predominantly Sunni organization, but it is killing Sunnis and Shia alike. Our vision for the future of Syria, as with Iraq, is not a sectarian entity, but one governed in the interests of all its people. So we wholeheartedly welcome the presence of states with both Sunni and Shia majorities at the Vienna talks and their support for international action, both against ISIL and towards a diplomatic solution in Syria. The House will also want to know what we're doing about the financing of ISIL. The document sets this out, and it includes intercepting smugglers, sealing borders, and enforcing sanctions to stop people trading with ISIL. But ultimately, ISIL is able to generate income through its control of territory. So while we're working with international partners to squeeze the finances wherever we can, it's the rolling back of ISIL's territory which will ultimately cut off its finances. Now, two of the most complex questions in an undoubtedly complex situation are these. First, will acting against ISIL in Syria actually help to bring about transition? I believe the answer is yes, not least because there can't be genuine transition without maintaining the territorial integrity of Syria. And ISIL completely deny, with their current action, this integrity. Crucially, destroying ISIL helps the moderate forces, and these moderate forces will be crucial to Syria's future. Second, does our view that Assad must go help in the fight against ISIL? Or as some claim, does this confuse the picture? The expert advice I have could not be more clear. We will not beat ISIL if we waver in our view that ultimately Assad must go. We cannot win over majority Sunni opinion, which is vital for the long-term stability of Syria, if we were to suddenly change our position. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the end, it comes back to this one main question: should we take action? All those who say that ultimately we need a diplomatic solution and a transition to a new government in Syria, they are right. Working with a new representative government is the way to eradicate ISIL in Syria in the long term. But can we wait for that to happen before we take military action? I say we can't. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. There will not be a vote in this House unless there's a clear majority for action, because we will not hand a publicity coup to ISIL. Mr. Speaker, I'm also clear that any motion we bring before this House will explicitly recognise that military action is not the whole answer. Proud as I am of our incredible servicemen and women, I will not pretend or overstate the significance of our potential contribution. I will not understate the complexity of this issue, nor the risks that are inevitably involved in any military action. But, Mr. Speaker, we do face a fundamental threat to our security. We can't wait for a political transition. We have to hit these terrorists in their heartlands right now. And we must not shirk our responsibility for security or hand it to others. Mr. Speaker, throughout our history, the United Kingdom has stood up to defend our values and our way of life. We can and we must do so again. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for providing an advanced copy of his statement, which I got earlier today. After the despicable and horrific attacks in Paris a fortnight ago, the whole House will, I'm sure, agree that our first priority has to be the security of people in this country in the future. So when we consider the Prime Minister's case for military action, the issue of whether what he proposes strengthens or undermines our security must be front and centre stage of our minds. There's no doubt that the so-called Islamic State group has imposed a reign of terror on millions in Iraq, in Syria, and now in Libya. All that ISIL stands for and does is contrary to everything those of us on these benches have struggled for over many generations. There is no doubt that it poses a threat to our own people. The question must now be whether extending the UK bombing from Iraq to Syria is likely to reduce or increase that threat, and whether it will counter or spread the terror campaign ISIL is waging in the Middle East. With that in mind, Mr. Speaker, I would like to put 7 questions to the Prime Minister. First, does the Prime Minister believe that extending airstrikes to Syria, which is already being bombed by the United States, France and Russia and other powers, will make a significant military impact on the ground, which has so far seen ISIL gain as well as lose territory? Does he expect it will be a war-winning strategy, or does he think other members of the original coalition, including the Gulf states, Canada and Australia, have halted their participation? Second, is the Prime Minister's view that the air campaign against ISIL-held areas can be successful without ground forces? If not, does he believe that the Kurdish forces or the relatively marginal remote Free Syrian Army would be in a position to back up ISIL-held territory, to take back ISIL-held territory if the air campaign were successful? Is it not more likely that other strongest jihadist and radical Salafist forces would take over? Third, without credible or acceptable ground forces, isn't the logic of an intensified air campaign mission creep and Western boots on the ground? Can he today rule out the deployment of British ground forces to Syria? Fourth, does the Prime Minister believe that the United Nations Security Resolution 2249 gives clear and unambiguous authorization for UK airstrikes? And what coordinated action with other United Nations member states has there been under the terms of the resolution to cut off funding, oil revenues and arms supplies from ISIL into the territory it currently holds? And in the absence of any coordinated UN military or diplomatic strategy, does he believe that more military forces over Syria could increase the risks of dangerous incidents, such as the shooting down of a Russian military aircraft by Turkish forces this week? Fifth, how does the Prime Minister think an extension of UK bombing would contribute to a comprehensive, negotiated political settlement of the Syrian civil war, which is widely believed to be the only way to ensure the defeat of ISIL in the country? The Vienna conference last weekend was a good step forward, but it has some way to go. Sixth, what assessment has the Prime Minister been given about the likely impact of British airstrikes in Syria on the threat of terrorist attacks in Britain? And what impact does he believe an intensified air campaign will have on civilian casualties in the ISIS-held territory and the wider Syrian refugee crisis, which is so enormous and so appalling? Finally, Mr. Speaker, in the light of the record of Western military intervention in recent years, including Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya, does the Prime Minister accept that UK bombing of Syria could risk more of what President Obama called unintended consequences, and that a lasting defeat of ISIL can only be secured by Syrians and their forces within the region.
Well, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his questions, and let me say that I very much, respect his long-held views about these issues and his quite correct caution before committing to any of these actions. But I do believe there is a good answer to the 7 absolutely legitimate questions he asks. First of all, in terms of extending airstrikes, would there be a significant military impact? What I tried to give in my statement a flavour of the specific things we think we would be able to do. But in many ways, it is worth listening to our closest allies. It's worth listening to the Americans and the French, who want us to take part, not just for the cover that provides, but because of the capabilities that we bring. And I think it's worth listening very closely to what they say. So my answer to that question is, yes, we would make a military difference. Second, he's absolutely right to raise this issue of ground forces, and I tried to tackle it as fully as I could in my statement. I would just guide the House that there are obviously many who want to play down the existence and the role of the Free Syrian Army. Our information and intelligence is that there are at least 70,000 moderate Sunni forces that are able to help. And we can see the help that they've been given, including the examples I gave in my statement. He asked about boots on the ground. Let me give an assurance. We are not deploying British combat forces. We're not going to deploy British combat forces. We think actually the presence of Western boots on the ground in that way would be counterproductive. That is one of the things I think we have all collectively across the House learned from previous conflicts, and we don't want to make that mistake again. Fourth question is whether the UN resolution is unambiguous. I believe it is. I think the language in that resolution is very clear, and that's why I quoted it in some detail. He rightly asked what else is the UN doing on sanctions and embargoes and squeezing the finances of ISIL. There was a resolution back in February, and we should continue to support all those measures. He asked under that question about dangerous incidents and the potential for those. As I explained in the statement, there is a deconfliction between what Russia is doing and what the coalition is doing. Obviously, what happened in Turkey, as I said yesterday, we have to get to the bottom of that. But obviously, we have permission to overfly Turkish airspace, and Turkey is our ally in this conflict. He asked the crucial question, question 5, about whether what we're planning will help with transition. And I think the answer to that is a very strong yes. The existence of ISIL, or Daesh as many call it, with their so-called caliphate, is to deny the territorial integrity of both Iraq and Syria. So we can't have a future Syria with the existence of this caliphate taking over such a large amount of its territory. I'd also make the point that when we look to the future of Syria, it's going to need the involvement of moderate Sunnis in the future of that country. And so the more we can help them, the better the chance of transition is. He asked the very important question about the impact of action on the threat level to this country. And that's why I quoted, and I have their permission to do so, I cleared my statement with them, the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee and the head of MI5, that their view is that we are already at the very highest level we could be in terms of threats from ISIL. And again, this is about learning the lessons of Iraq. We have now this architecture of a Joint Intelligence Committee chaired by a very senior official who has that independent view, and I cleared every word of my statement very clearly with them. On the issue of civilian casualties, which is important, I believe the truth of the matter is this, that the British capabilities are one of the best ways to reduce civilian casualties. In a year and 3 months of the action we've taken in Iraq, there have been no reports of civilian casualties. We believe that we have some of the most accurate weapons known to man. So I think extending our activities into Syria is likely to reduce civilian casualties rather than increase them. Finally, he asked about unintended consequences and the recent history that we faced. We can have a bigger debate, I'm sure, about the action that we've had to take around the world. In my view, we have to recognize that this poisonous narrative of Islamist extremism is a battle for our generation. We see it in Nigeria, we see it in Somalia. Frankly, we can see it sometimes in our own country, and combating with everything we've got, which is not just military means, it's combating it with argument. It's combating it by taking away grievances. It's all those things together. But I believe we thought through the consequences of this action, and in quoting President Obama as he did, I think it is worth remembering that this American president, who saw that part of his role was withdrawing America from some of these foreign entanglements and trying to take a different approach to these actions, he is not only firmly behind American action in Syria, he's asking America's oldest friend and partner and ally to help out in this vital work.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
I thank my right honourable friend for responding so comprehensively to the Foreign Affairs Committee report. And whilst he's there, can I also thank the Chancellor for responding positively to our first report on the Foreign Office budget yesterday. Part of the committee has returned early from the region around ISIL for this statement. Other colleagues are completing visits to 10 capitals in the region over this week, and acquiring that regional perspective is part of our inquiry into the coalition against ISIL, as was our initial report, which addressed the narrow issue of British airstrikes over Syria. Behind that narrow issue sit the bigger questions of Britain's full involvement in the coalition and whether that coalition has a strategy to achieve the aim of defeating ISIL in Syria and Iraq. Does he agree with the senior leaders we met in the region that getting the politics right in both Iraq and Syria is the immediate and overriding priority, and we must not lose focus on Baghdad? The committee will discuss its collective view early next week, and we will also want to report to the House on the prospects of success for the coalition strategy in the new year. Will my right honourable friend come before the committee in about 2 months' time to give evidence to us on the implementation of this strategy laid out today? But is he aware that in the light of Vienna and his response to the committee, it is now my personal view that, on balance, the country would be best served by this House supporting his judgment that the United Kingdom should play a full role in the coalition to best support and shape the politics, thus enabling the earliest military and eventual ideological defeat of ISIL.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend, first of all, for coming back to be with us in the House today. Thank him for the report, but above all, thank him for what he said today about the decision that he's reached with this difficult decision we all have to make. I think he's absolutely right that any action we take must be nested in an overall strategy, which I've tried to set out today. He's absolutely right that the politics of the region are crucial in our understanding of this. Most important of all, trying to make sure that Iraq makes progress to being a more pluralistic and solid country that doesn't face the risk of ISIL. And as I said, the politics and the action, in my view, go together. He asked whether I'll come back to his committee and indeed to the House within 2 months. I'm very happy to come back in any way that people want me to, whether it's making, if we decide to go ahead with this action, whether to make a regular update to the House of Commons, or indeed appear in front of his committee to go through detailed questions. I am, in this, as in all things, the House's servant.
Mr. Angus Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I begin by thanking the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for the briefing by his National Security Advisor and colleagues last night. Given the seriousness of the issues that we're all grappling with, it was valuable to have that briefing, and myself and the Right Honourable Member for Gordon expressed our thanks to those who are working very hard to keep us all safe. Mr. Speaker, we in the Scottish National Party share the concerns of everybody in this House and in the country about the terrorist threat by Daesh. We deplore the Assad regime and repeatedly raise the issue of refugees both in the region and in Europe. The SNP strongly supports the international initiative on Syria agreed in Vienna to secure a ceasefire in Syria, the transition to stable representative government, and countering terrorist groups, including Daesh. We believe that these aims will only be secured through agreement and a serious long-term commitment to Syria. So may I ask the Prime Minister, how is the UK supporting the International Syria Support Initiative and other diplomatic efforts to secure that ceasefire in Syria, the political transition and combating terrorists like Daesh, and planning for the long-term reconstruction and stability support? Yesterday in Prime Minister's questions, I asked 2 questions about Syria, which the Prime Minister didn't answer, so I'd like to repeat them again today. How will the UK plan secure peace on the ground in Syria? As the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee asked, and I quote, which ground forces will take, hold and administer territories captured from ISIL in Syria? Not can, but will. The Prime Minister has talked about 70,000 Free Syrian Army troops. How many of those are in the northeast of Syria on the front line against Daesh as opposed to countering Syrian regime forces? How will the UK plan secure long-term stability and reconstruction in Syria? The UK spent 13 times more bombing Libya than on its post-conflict stability and reconstruction. So how much, as I asked yesterday, does the Prime Minister estimate the total cost of reconstruction will be, and does he think that the amount in his statement today will be sufficient? 2 years ago, the Prime Minister urged us to bomb the opponents of Daesh in Syria. That would probably have strengthened this terrorist organisation. Today, the Prime Minister wants us to launch a bombing campaign without effective ground support in place or a fully costed reconstruction and stability plan. The Prime Minister has asked us to consider his plan. We have listened closely. However, key questions posed by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee remain unanswered. And unless the Prime Minister answers these questions satisfactorily, the Scottish National Party will not vote for airstrikes in Syria.
Well, can I first of all thank him for paying tribute to my National Security Advisor, Mark Lyle-Grant, who's been working very hard and has tried to provide factual briefings on a Privy Council basis to parties across the House of Commons. Look, I think he is right that what is required is political agreement and the long-term reconstruction of Syria. My argument is not to disagree with that. My argument is that, as well as that, we need to take action now to help protect us against the terrorism that we've seen on the streets of Paris and elsewhere. He asked a technical question about how we're supporting the negotiation initiative in Vienna. Obviously, we're playing a full part in it through the Foreign Secretary. We're also helping to fund the work of the United Nations envoys who are trying to bring the parties together. Now, in terms of his 2 specific questions, who are the troops on the ground? Well, as I explained, there are the Free Syrian Army, there are the Kurdish forces, and of course that makes it a more complicated picture than Iraq, where you have the Iraq security forces. But these forces, we can help them to take and to hold ground and to relieve suffering. And you've seen that with what has happened around Kobane or what has happened with the Yazidis. Important progress can be made. Now, I was very frank in my statement. Of course, the true arrival of ground forces awaits the arrival of a new government in Syria. That is the best way, long-term, to eradicate entirely ISIL, to have that partner. But again, the question comes up, can we wait for that to happen before we take some action that will degrade ISIL and degrade its capabilities to do us harm? He asked about the long-term reconstruction of Syria. As we debated yesterday with the autumn statement, we have one of the largest development budgets anywhere in the world. I've said that we would already be prepared to commit £1 billion to that sort of reconstruction. And I think the whole world would come together when there's a new government in Syria. And the Syrian people, who currently are, many of them, outside their country, desperate to go home, they would not be left wanting for support. They'd get the support of Britain, but I believe they get the support of the whole developed world.
Mr. Kenneth Clark. The Prime Minister's made a compelling case for playing a proper part with our allies on both sides of the meaningless international border at the moment, and also for the political process that we can have a voice in of bringing the Americans closer to the Russians and the Saudis and the Turks closer to the Iranians. But does he accept that in the medium term we have to look for whatever agreement can produce stability and a more peaceful situation, and we may have to prepare ourselves for something that falls far short of what a liberal Western democracy would look like? Is not the experience of the Arab Spring that going straight to democratic elections does not produce a resolution, that any agreement's going to involve some rather unpleasant people being involved, and not just people who would naturally be our allies, and that Assad and other people may have to be involved because the big enemy is ISIL, which is dangerous and which is not possible to engage in any political negotiation.
I think my right honourable friend speaks with great wisdom about these matters, and it is very important to have his support. He's never been an unquestioning supporter of military action, and he thinks these things through very carefully. And what he says about clearly the future government of Syria, the transition that needs to take place, falling short of some of the democratic norms that we would want to see, yes, of course, that is likely. When I say that I believe Assad cannot be part of the long-term government of Syria, in many ways that is not a political preference. In my view, it's a statement of fact. There won't be a government of Syria that commands the support of the Syrian people if he is in charge of it, because of the blood that has been shed and because of what's happened in that country. But do I believe that a transition in Syria will produce some perfect Swiss-style democracy? No, of course it won't. But it might give us a partner with which we can complete the obliteration of ISIL and therefore make us safer.
Mr. David Winnick.
Can I remind him that 2 years ago he was equally eloquent in telling us how essential it was to bomb the Assad regime. I believe that the decision taken by the House in July 2013 was the correct one, and that had we followed his advice, the situation in Syria would be even worse than it is now. Would the Prime Minister agree that the crux of the issue for every member of this House is this: would military action help the situation to defeat ISIS? I happen to believe the answer is no, and I wonder how many members of the House really believe that it will make any real difference at all in defeating this hated death cult.
Well, I don't particularly want to re-enter all the arguments about chemical weapons use. All I will say is, of course, I listen to his views, but I also think of the thousands of people, including children, who've been killed by Assad's barrel bombs using chemical weapons since we held that vote. But he asked absolutely the right question: will this make us safer or not? Will this help to degrade ISIL or not? Now, it's the views of our closest allies, it's the views of our military, it's the views of our intelligence experts, it's the views of those responsible for our domestic security. All of those people are saying to us that we should take this action as part of a coalition to help make us safer. And that is why I bring forward this statement, and with the support of the House, I'll bring forward a vote.
Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Following the limited but important progress on the political track in Vienna and the unanimous adoption by the United Nations of Resolution 2249 on ISIL, is it not clear, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister's considered response today is absolutely compelling? Is this not the way we discharge our responsibility to protect innocent civilians, both here in the United Kingdom and in Syria?
Well, I'm very grateful for my right honourable friend's support. I think this is about discharging our responsibilities, chiefly to our own citizens. It is my considered view that this action will help over time to make us safer. We'll never be safe while ISIL exists, while this so-called caliphate exists, and we've demonstrated in Iraq that we can take its territory, we can destroy so much of its infrastructure, we can make real progress, but we are hampered by not being able to do the same in Syria. And if we agree that the eradication of ISIL is essential for our national security, we shouldn't put off the decision.
Mr. George Howarth.
The Prime Minister is, I'm sure, correct to say that the continued existence of the so-called caliphate is an inspiration to violent extremists, not only in the Middle East, but even in our own country. Could he perhaps give some indication, I know these things are still subject to negotiation, however, about what the characteristics of a legitimate transitional government might be?
Well, first of all, let me agree with him about the so-called caliphate. As I tried to set out in my statement, there are the military objectives in terms of trying to break up the terrorist training camps, infrastructure, and the terrorists themselves. But there is a bigger picture, which is while this so-called caliphate exists, I don't believe that we are safe, and so we should be part of its dismantling. The question he asks about the characteristics of transition, this is what's being discussed in Vienna, but it should start with ceasefires. It should then proceed to the political work of drawing up what a transitional government and institutions would look like, and then to be followed probably by elections and at some stage a transition away from the current leadership. As I said in reply to the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, this won't be a perfect or scientific process, but to me it is essential, because in the end it is political transition that will help us to complete the final destruction of ISIL. Military force cannot do it on its own. And I'm not coming to this dispatch box saying there is a purely military solution. There isn't. There's a political, diplomatic and military solution, and we need to do all of the bits of that.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Many honourable and right honourable members, including me personally, entirely agree with the Prime Minister that ISIL-Daesh must be crushed militarily in Syria, and the crushing will indeed have to be military. But as he acknowledged at PMQs yesterday, airstrikes alone will not be effective. They've got to be in coordination with credible ground forces. Now, the suggestion that there are 70,000 non-Islamist, moderate, credible ground forces, I have to say, is a revelation to me, and I suspect most other members in this House. Adequate ground forces, in my view, depend on the participation of the Syrian army. So if the dictator Assad refuses to resign, which is the greater danger to our national interests? Syria under him, or the continued existence and expansion of ISIL-Daesh? Because you may have to choose between one and the other.
Well, great respect for my honourable friend who thinks about these things very carefully, and there's a lot of grounds of agreement between us. We agree in the dangers of ISIL. We agree it needs to be crushed. We agree that will need the involvement of ground forces, and we also agree, as I put in my response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that we need an ISIL-first strategy, that ISIL is the greater threat to the United Kingdom. I think the only area of disagreement between us is one on a technical point, and one slightly more profound, but I think not unbridgeable. The technical point is what I've said about 70,000 moderate forces in Syria is not my figure. It is the considered opinion of the Joint Intelligence Committee, a committee that was set up and given independence to avoid any of the mistakes that were dealt with, that we had in the past, of the potential misuse of intelligence and other information. It is their considered view. That document has been entirely cleared by them, as has my statement. The other issue we have to come to is that, of course, he and I agree that in time the best ground troops should be the Syrian army. My view is that will be more likely to happen after a political transition has taken place in Syria. And my contention is the problem of believing it can be done with Assad is that you'll never get the ceasefires, you'll never get the participation of the Sunni majority in Syria while Assad is still there. But I think the area of disagreement between us is narrowing, as is the area of disagreement between Britain, America and France and the Russians. We all now see the need for there to be both a military and a political solution.
Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est?